All right, hello everyone. It's noon right on the dot, so we'll go ahead and get started with our webinar today. Um, this is going to be a webinar about the basics of high tunnel design. My name is Cary Rivard. I'm a fruit and vegetable extension specialist here at Kansas State University. Welcome to our webinar series focused on greenhouse and high tunnel construction. For those of you that don't know, we'll be doing this series of webinars over the next really 2 years. Um, Hoping to cover all the material from start to finish of how to build your own high tunnel and or greenhouse. So our next one is scheduled for March 18th, and Mark Garin from Cultivate Kansas City is going to be with us talking about siding and layout and some of the prep work that they did when they built their greenhouse up at the Stowe Farm in Kansas City, Kansas. So please do join us for that. If you're not already part of our email list, you can sign up here. There's a QR code that'll get you signed up with the Urban Food Systems Initiative, and that is one of the ways that we advertise this webinar series. Just as a reminder, this webinar is supported by a USDA NIFA Beginning Farmer Rancher Grant program, so shout out to those folks for the help on that side of things. All right, so today we're going to be talking about really high tunnel design. And one of the things that I've been fortunate in my career to work in and around a whole bunch of different high tunnels, both on commercial farms and here at the research station. So I work at the Olathe Horticulture Research and Extension Center. You can see a picture here. We do lots of research with high tunnels, um, excuse me, of all shapes and sizes. So you can see we have traditional four-season tunnels, three-season tunnels, we have a movable tunnel, and we have caterpillar tunnels. And we'll be talking about all of those today. So our real goal for this webinar is to give you enough background about the different type of tunnel options so that if you want to go buy your own high tunnel or potentially buy one used or new, you have a better idea of what you're looking at and maybe what some of your needs are. There are lots of options when we talk about purchasing high tunnels, and they come in a wide range of prices as well too. So, again, our goal is not to teach you how to build the high tunnel yet. We'll get there. But really just what to think about when you're purchasing one or think about, building one for yourself. So here you can see sort of a list of what we're going to be talking about today. A little bit about design principles. We'll talk about thermal mass and water management and a few of those things to consider whenever you're interested in investing in a tunnel. And then we'll get into the nuts and bolts of it, quite literally, talking about framing options, coverings, sidewalls, and in walls. And my hope is that, especially, I've got a lot of pictures in here. I really have a lot of slides to share. I'm hoping to give you a whole bunch of examples of different tunnels that I've been in and around that can help, elucidate some of these questions for y'all. What are we not going to be talking about today is construction. So actually, starting next month, we do have a series of how-to videos that are going to start. Again, we're going to do the siding and prep work first. Then we'll go into the four corners and assembling the frame, in walls, side walls, and each one of those is going to be its own hour-long webinar. So don't get too excited yet. We're not going to be talking about construction yet. But I do think that it's really important before you start going out and getting your own tunnel to think about what kind of design you want. Off the record, I would also mention this is part of a high tunnel build I was part of a long time ago in Lawrence, Kansas. This is definitely not the ideal situation. You can see how wet it is. We are destroying the soil of that poor tunnel as we were building it. If you're going to build a high tunnel, excuse me, please do it in the fall. Typically in the spring, it's really hard to work around the weather, at least here in the Midwest. And the last thing you want to do is just cause a lot of compaction and other issues with soil, as you can see, is exactly what's happening right here. The other thing I wanted to mention is that there is a program, in case y'all aren't aware already, called the EQUIP program through NRCS. This stands for Environmental Quality Initiatives Program. And it actually covers lots of different things that can be utilized on the farm, things like drip irrigation, things like cover cropping. But at some point, they did start a high tunnel initiative within EQUIP that specifically funds high tunnels. And since about 2005 or so, when that program started, this program has built thousands of high tunnels around the country. And it's interesting, you can actually see many of the greenhouse companies will advertise NRCS approved tunnels. For what it's worth, most, I think all tunnels are technically NRCS approved. Um, Now, if you're interested in participating in this program, there's a lot of information on the web, but the most important thing to understand is that all of these EQUIP tunnels are administrated locally. So you really need to talk with your local district office or your state conservationist in order to initiate the process. They're done on a state by state basis, not nationally or federally. And so what that means is each state has kind of its own rules and ways that you go about it. There was a time here in Kansas, I don't think it's true anymore, where you had to be certified organic in order to get EQUIP. Um, and they did away with that because there was a lot of growers that weren't growing organically, and um, but in each state it could be a little bit different. Now, one thing that's important to note is this is a cost share program, so it's going to be 75 to 90% of the cost. Historically, that 90% was only for underserved communities. I honestly don't know what the story is with that these days, so I wouldn't count on any more than 75%. Um, and it generally works as a through a reimbursement basis. So you still have to put the money up front in order to buy the tunnel, but you will get that money back from NRCS after you file the paperwork and do all those things. Now, I spoke with our state conservationist the other day, Tim Miller here in Kansas. And we just went through a round of EQUIP grants that finished January 15th. But based on his understanding and sort of the landscape in federal funding these days, it looks like the NRCS program, the EQUIP program's not going anywhere. There have been a lot of cuts to NRCS sort of globally. But from what he can tell, it seems like EQUIP is still here to stay. One other thing I wanted to mention is we do have the website called hightunnels.org. It's actually going through a renovation process this very moment, so hopefully one day you'll see a whole different page here. But there's a lot of good resources and information there as well. So, as all of you know, high tunnels can come in lots of shapes and sizes, and we'll talk about many of those today. There's a lot of benefits to utilizing high tunnels in different parts of the country. Here in the Midwest, we love them for their ability to provide season extension and also storm protection is really important. We get hailstorms and windstorms that blow through, and especially for those high value fruiting vegetables, it's really nice to have those things protected in a tunnel. Now, if you're going to build a high tunnel, one of the first things you want to ask yourself is what are you going to grow? And more importantly, is how are you going to grow it? Um, and you've got lots of different options out there. I think for many of us, when we think of high tunnels, we think of greens and winter production. Late fall, early spring production of greens and other cool season crops is one of the most common use of high tunnels. It's a great way to extend your season. And here in the Midwest, we have lots of greens that are actually very tolerant of very, very cold temperatures. And so, we can grow them in the fall and then basically just hold them over in the tunnel until it's time to harvest them. Tomatoes, sort of the king of the high tunnel, at least in this part of the world. Here in Kansas, and I think much of Missouri, most of our growers that are growing tomatoes have gone away from open field production because it's just not reliable. We have issues with spring frosts and rains, and again, some of the other things that I mentioned before. And so we're seeing a lot of our tomato production within high tunnels, and in general, warm season crops as well. And, one of the things I like to let folks know is that, we can grow more than just tomatoes in the high tunnel. It's important to utilize crop rotations. So, lots of other things. You can see zucchini squash in here. Cucumbers do excellent in the tomato in the high tunnels. Peppers do really well. Any of your warm season crops that really like that added heat during the summer. One thing to think about, depending on what crop you're going to grow, is if you are going to be trellising them through a hanging string trellis system. So this is sort of born out of Europe. Essentially, what we're going to do is we're going to hang strings from these metal wires, and then in this case with tomatoes, we'll clip them up and they'll attach themselves to those strings. And you can also see some English cucumbers here on the left. That's another one that works really well with that European string trellis system. So if you're going to do that, keep in mind that you're going to have a lot of vertical load or a lot of vertical weight pulling on that tunnel. and it's going to be important to get a tunnel that's strong enough to hold that. The other thing to be aware is that you're going to typically going to be attaching these cables to the in walls. And so if you're going to be doing that, you want to beef up your in wall, make it stronger so that it can hold that weight. I have seen tunnels collapse from the in walls in because the weight of those tomatoes just pull it right in. So you want to be real careful about that as well. Cut flowers are a really popular thing to be grown in high tunnels, and they really benefit from that protected area and a little bit less light too, because it helps stretch the stems, so they make better cut flowers. Here's some day neutral strawberries that we did some research trials with. We've done quite a bit of work with day neutral strawberries in tunnels. They seem to work fairly well here in Kansas. A lot of folks are moving into sort of containerized production, especially as tunnels get older and we have issues with soil-borne diseases and whatnot. You can see these grow bags are really useful. So, all these different production systems are going to be benefited from slightly different design of the high tunnel. I know a lot of folks that also use at least a portion of their high tunnel for hardening off and growing transplants, basically using it like a big cold frame. So, think about the different types of crops that you plan to grow in that tunnel before you start having the conversation about what should this tunnel look like. In terms of design principles, the most important thing is just remember that we are managing the microclimate within this tunnel, and we're doing this in lots of different ways. People oftentimes forget we are manipulating the light, not only the spectral quality and quantity of the light. Um, so you need to make sure that you're doing that in a way that's going to benefit your crops. Temperature obviously is an important one. Airflow is very important in order to make sure we reduce diseases. And then to the best of your ability, although it's typically pretty different and difficult in a tunnel, trying to keep the humidity down again to help prevent some of those foliar diseases like botrytis. So one of the most important design principles to think about when you're purchasing a high tunnel is this concept of thermal mass. And this is the same thing holds for greenhouses as well. So during the day, that high tunnel is going to serve like a big heat battery. It's going to absorb a whole lot of heat from the sun, right? It's going to heat up the soil. It's going to heat up the air. It's also going to heat up water that's in the soil, which is really important as well, right? And so the bigger the tunnel is, the more energy it can hold in that heat battery. And so when the larger thermal mass you have, the slower it's going to heat up and the slower it's going to cool back down, right? And that's really important for two different reasons. One, we don't want it to get too hot too quickly in the morning, but also in the evening, you're going to have more energy that's stored in that tunnel to help you get through the cold nights. And there's some folks that are, maybe you've seen some of these south-facing greenhouses where they'll put barrels of water along the north wall to help absorb that heat energy and then again radiate it back out at night. So in general, when we're talking about thermal mass, really bigger is better. And it's important to recognize that there is such thing as too big of a high tunnel. This is a 1 acre high tunnel that's out in Kingsville, Missouri at Powell Gardens. This was 11 bays of a multi-bay tunnel. This is a very serious high tunnel. But the bigger that tunnel is, the more heat it's going to be able to hold overnight. And again, what's equally as important is the slower it's going to warm up in the morning and in the day as well. Now, keep in mind, even though it's bigger is better, it's also important that if you're going to be growing in the winter time, like true winter production, like you see this spinach here, you want to make sure you can seal that tunnel up pretty good in terms of the sidewalls, the in walls, the doors. You don't want them leaking too much air because you are going to rely on the ability of it to hold that heat overnight. Whereas, with our bigger three-season tunnel, this thing doesn't even really have a true in wall, right? And so it's not really geared for winter production. Whereas something like this four-season tunnel, it's going to be able to hold that heat in. And it's amazing. Look at all that snow that's built up outside of that tunnel. And these spinach are just super duper happy in there. The other thing we like to talk about with high tunnels is ventilation. And ventilation is really important um, in terms of managing the crop. And it also can be detrimental if we have a lot of wind here in Kansas. That can be another challenge that you have to deal with. So the taller the sidewall is, the better ventilation you're going to get. That's a general rule of thumb. When they first started selling high tunnels back in the late 90s, early 2000s, they were building them just like greenhouses. In greenhouses, we typically have a 3 foot sidewall or a hip board that's 3 feet up. And they did start doing that early on with high tunnels, but now generally the standard is to be about 4 to 5 feet for that sidewall height. And that's going to be a lot better for making sure you get good ventilation. Um, there is this rule, the 6X rule, which basically says that anything that's in the way of the wind, you basically need to multiply 6 times the height of that in order for it to not be an obstruction. So, in other words, if the wind is coming from this side on these tunnels, this tunnel is going to be blocking the air out for this tunnel unless you move it 6 times the height of this tunnel away from it. Right now, in our case in Kansas, we have a lot of wind, so ventilation's not really a big issue, and I wouldn't get too stressed out about it. But if you are in a part of the country where you have less wind to deal with, that can be a good rule of thumb. And we'll talk more about orientation of the tunnel. Depending on the type of tunnel, generally we're going to put those east-west so that the wind can run across them. So this kind of shows that through a picture. In this case, this was in Goldsboro, North Carolina. We had prevailing winds from the south-southwest. So we literally went out there with a compass. Keep in mind that in North Carolina, they don't have the breezy summers that we do here in Kansas, right? And we knew ventilation was going to be really important and that we need to maximize it to the best of our abilities. So we literally went out there with a compass and oriented these tunnels exactly 90 degrees perpendicular of that southwest prevailing wind. And you don't have to go that crazy, I think, if you're in the Midwest, but if you're in the Southeast, I don't think it's a bad idea to keep that in mind. Now, in terms of locating, you're also going to want to think about plumbing, electrical, heating, if you have any of those things associated with your tunnel. But that's more, we can talk about that later in the webinar. So this is an overhead picture of our research station, and you can see those tunnels that I pointed out earlier. Here's some four-season tunnels. Here's our three-season, our Haygrove multi-bay tunnel, solo tunnel, movable tunnel. So our prevailing wind comes from the south. And what you'll notice is that these tunnels are not oriented in the same direction. The four-season tunnels are running east and west. Our Caterpillar tunnels are running east and west, so they're going to get a nice breeze through that sidewall and across the crop that's going to help ventilate those. In the case of these multi-bay tunnels, it's actually a bad idea to do that because when you have multiple bays next to each other, you can get sinusoidal activity that will actually pull on that um, roof more so than going the other direction. And I wasn't actually working here at K-State when these were installed, but they were put with parallel with the prevailing wind. And keep in mind, these tunnels don't have true in walls, and they're very, 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 very large. And so instead of blowing across them, it actually works better to blow the air end to end because, again, they don't have any in walls to block that. In the case of the movable tunnel, we put it there because that's where we had the spot for it, right? And sometimes that's the way it goes. And again, especially here in the Midwest where we have a fair amount of wind, it's not too big of an issue to just put it where you think it should go. Now, one of the things we want to think about in ventilation is how we're going to ventilate the tunnel itself. So again, if you're putting this perpendicular to the prevailing wind, the goal is that the air is going to be blowing in through the sidewalls and either going to blow straight across the high tunnel or it's going to be ventilated through the gable vents and exit out through the peak of the roof. Now, keep in mind that if you're growing in the wintertime, this gable vent becomes extremely important because, around here we'll have 20-degree days in January, no problem, right? And you don't want 20-degree air blowing on your crops. And oftentimes it's cold enough that all you really need to do is open up that gable vent, and that's going to let out the bit of hot air that's collecting within the tunnel. So, again, if you are growing in the wintertime, really the winter or summer, I think it's really important to have that gable vent. But during the wintertime, there'll be oftentimes where you might use it where you're not opening the sidewalls at all and only using the gable vents to ventilate the tunnel. Water management is a big issue, so making sure that that tunnel is elevated is going to be important, and also the size of that matters too. This is a picture of our big multi-bay tunnel. This thing is a half acre total. When it rains, things get serious, right? There's a lot of water that comes off of this thing, and so you want to make sure that you have your drainage set up in a way that's manageable. And as I mentioned in the next webinar next month, we're going to be talking exactly about that topic. In terms of site preparation, again, we won't talk too much about the details here, but just keep in mind that the process of building this high tunnel can be very hard on the soil, right? And I've seen folks get out there with bulldozers and road graders and all kinds of stuff, to build up the soil. It's a great idea to build up the soil, but if you're running this giant machine over it, I would not expect your crops to do very well for a couple of years. One thing we have done is we've used chisel plows in the past. So essentially, we set all the footers for the tunnel, and then we run, 24 to 30-inch deep chisel plow through there to really, loosen up some of that heavy clay underneath and help increase the drainage through the soil. And the key to the game here is make sure you do that before you put your hoops on, because generally a tractor strong enough to pull a chisel plow is not going to fit underneath your hoops, right? So put up the footers, put up your baseboard, and then go ahead and run the chisel plow, and you'll be ready to go. Last but maybe most important is keep in mind that all of these things are going to require maintenance. And especially, you will be recovering the polyfilm roof at least once every 4 years. Depending on if you have windstorms, it can be more often than that. And then if you're using wood framing for your sidewalls and in walls, that stuff's going to have to be replaced every 10 to 15 years. Anything touching the ground is going to be more likely to rot. So, like the baseboards will have to be replaced every 3 to 5 years. So, doing that maintenance is going to, really help increase your investment and hopefully the lifespan of your tunnel in the long run. Okay, so let's talk about some of the different types of tunnels. In terms of framing, you really have two basic frames, the Quonset style and the Gothic style, and we'll talk about those here in a second. And then there's other types of tunnels that have sort of developed, and I'll show some pictures of those, but we're really going to be mainly sticking to the stationary four-season tunnels today. So movable tunnels, that's sort of one of the new things that came out about 8, 10 years ago. This is the one we have at the research station. This is a Rimmel Rolling Thunder. It's a little bit different than many of the other ones out there. The nice thing about movable tunnels is it allows you to um, utilize cover crops, utilize crop rotation. You're basically using a larger space with the same size high tunnel. So in this case, this movable tunnel is on a 200-foot long track and it's a 64-foot long tunnel. So we have three different positions that we can put it on so that we can practice better crop rotation and utilize the space outside the tunnel for growing cover crops and helping to build the soil. So the next thing you might be asking yourself is, what about the size? How big of a tunnel should I get? Well, we talked about thermal mass before, and again, bigger is better when it comes to thermal mass. I think most growers that I've talked to that work in and around high tunnels always tend to say, buy the biggest tunnel that you can afford because you're going to end up using the whole thing. Chances are, within a couple years, you can be buying another one to add to it. So um, within reason, get kind of the biggest one that you can in terms of footprint. And now, in terms of height, that it becomes quite a bit more variable here. This is a tunnel that I think this is a Stuppy that I saw down in Fayetteville, Arkansas a couple years ago. You can see it has an 8-foot sidewall. This is a monster of a high tunnel, right? I mean, this thing is a beast. And that's great because it has this huge thermal mass. You're going to get really nice ventilation through those big sidewalls. There's no gable vent here. We'll talk later about why that might be. But keep in mind, there are some costs that go along with that. And especially when it comes to maintenance, when you have to recover the roof on this thing, it's a way more difficult job because everybody's on ladders no matter what. And the peak of this high tunnel is probably 20 to 22 feet. I don't know exactly for sure. But working up and around there is fairly dangerous. And it's, important to keep those types of things in mind. If you don't need that 8 foot sidewall, I wouldn't necessarily recommend it because it's really just getting a little bit excessive. Now, the nice thing about that tall sidewall is if you are growing crops like tomatoes on a European string trellis and you need that vertical height, we have people that are playing around with growing fruit in high tunnels, right? You need that vertical space. Then that might be a good reason to get that bigger sidewall. In terms of sourcing materials, there's lots of different options out there, and I'm not here um, to sort of say that one is better than the other. One of the things that I've found, we've got tunnels from lots of different companies that I've worked with. I've built tunnels built by Stuppy, built by Zimmerman's, built by Atlas, built by FarmTech. There's lots of them out there. Um, they're not all the same. And I built a Rimmel tunnel as well. And one thing to keep in mind is ask some questions, do some digging, and look at the size of not only the piping or the hoops, but also the gauge of the metal as well too, because there are big differences in some of these tunnels in terms of the thickness and the quality of the metal that goes into the frame. The other thing that's really important for these things is shipping costs. This is our movable tunnel when it arrived. It always amazes me when you see this little package of stuff that turned out to be a 30 foot by 64-foot high tunnel with 200-foot rails. Um, but the shipping costs are very expensive, especially these days. And so trying to find something local or local-ish can be very helpful, or something that you can pick up yourself if you have a trailer in order to do that. The other thing that's nice about having something that's local or semi-local is when you need replacement parts, or if you're in the construction process and you realize, oh man, I cut one of my pieces of polycarb wrong and I need a new piece. For example, we have stuffy greenhouses here in Kansas City. There have been times that I've been on working on a project and like I need one piece of twin wall polycarb, right? So in that case, I can drive to Stuffy, I can pick it up and bring it home. If we didn't have that resource available to us, then I wouldn't be able to do that. So, it is a good idea to try and find some type of local greenhouse manufacturer, even if they're not even the ones selling you the tunnel. You might end up finding that you buy other things from them as well. A lot of people are buying and using used tunnels these days, and I think that's a great plan to just keep in mind it takes a lot longer to tear down a high tunnel than it does to put one up. So, be ready to invest some time in taking that thing apart if that's part of the job for you. And if it's not, um, you know, trying to build a high tunnel from a pile of parts laying in somebody's pasture, if you've never done this before, is going to be very, very tricky. Okay, so Quonset style high tunnels are sort of the most common and the things that we see the most. These are going to be the ones with the rounded tops, essentially, and they are the least expensive. Now, there's a couple challenges that can go along with them. One is that they are a little bit more prone to snow damage. So they have this, there's a flat spot on the top of this roof that's going to collect snow, and it's much less likely to slide off of there. So that's one of the big challenges with growing in Quonset frames. There are some high tunnel manufacturers that build Quonset frames where the whole bow is one big semicircle. Instead of having a vertical sidewall and then a bow on top of that sidewall, it's the whole thing. And that's what this picture is trying to illustrate. If you can see it, see how it comes at that angle. One of the challenges with that is when you open that sidewall, rain will actually trickle into your high tunnel. So I'd be careful about that as well. I really liked high tunnels that have a straight vertical sidewall. So here's a picture of a Quonset truss. If you're not familiar with how trusses work, essentially the idea is that as wind or snow pushes down on this roof, it's going to distribute the weight and that force really onto this truss. And that truss is then going to distribute that force back to the footer or the hoop. And we all know from our engineering classes, triangles are the strongest thing. And so depending on what type of a tunnel you get, and especially the width of the tunnel, it's going to have more or less webbing within this truss. But in general, more is better. And having a truss is generally better than not having one. This is our four-season tunnel. We were using a, sorry, three-season tunnel. We were using a four-season way. There's no trusses on this tunnel. It's not built to hold a snow load. We were doing a research trial that we had to keep this stuff covered over winter. And so we got creative and just put some two by fours to hold that vertical weight. And you can do that type of thing. I've also seen greenhouses that actually have structure, like big H bars that basically attach to the bows and keep that vertical weight as well too. So there's things you can get a little bit creative. Just keep in mind this is not ideal. This is something we do in a semi-emergency situation, right? We don't want to plan for this. And I would also just mention too, the safety captain and me would tell you don't ever go inside of a tunnel like this. Like I took this picture and immediately jumped outside of the tunnel. You can imagine if you start banging around on this from the inside, there's a chance you can cause it to collapse. And I can't imagine what a terrible experience that would be, but it's something I certainly don't want to live through. So if you are ever under a tunnel that looks like this with a lot of weight on it, just be aware that there is a very real safety hazard that goes along with that. Now, there are Quonset style tunnels out there that don't have trusses. This is a commercial grower here in Kansas. In this case, this is a stumpy high tunnel, excuse me. And if you were to look, you'd actually see that the bows themselves they're like 2 and 7/8 inches. They're really big around, very sturdy, right? And so for that reason, they didn't need to have a truss, essentially. We have a similar hoop house that doesn't have trusses here at the research station, and it has square tubing. One of the things that I've learned over the years is apparently square tubing is way stronger than round tubing. So if you find, especially like a used high tunnel with square tubing, pick it up because they're way more stout than that round tubing is. Gothic style high tunnels are really common in areas where they get a fair amount of snow. And they do actually provide protection from wind as well, a little bit better than a Quonset style tunnel. But in general, the Gothic style is going to be have a peaked roof. And so what that means is the snow is going to be able to slide off of it. It also, as I mentioned, provides a little resistance to the wind. If you're in a very warm part of the country and you're interested in potentially putting up a roof vent, then you're going to have a Gothic style high tunnel. We won't talk too much about roof vents today. They're not very common here in the Midwest. Down south, we see them more. It's a really great way to let heat out of your high tunnel or a greenhouse is to let it out up at the very top where it all builds up, right? And you can imagine, thinking about that picture we showed earlier, the convective movement of that air coming in the sidewall and then pushing that hot air out the top can be really, really effective. So I'm a big fan of the roof vents. We just don't really see them much here because we don't necessarily need them in this part of the country. The other thing that's nice about Gothic style tunnels is they have quite a bit more vertical strength. So if you are thinking about hanging crops from the ceiling, they're going to be better for that. Here's a tunnel up in Chicago. I love this picture because, most of us, when we plant high tunnels, we put our rows longitudinal with the tunnel. And the folks that were at this farm, they put it perpendicular with the tunnel. And I just thought that was really, really neat. So I got a picture of it. Again, you think about Chicago, they get a lot of snow, right? So that snow is going to be able to slide right off of that roof, hopefully. Sometimes it doesn't, depending on how wet and sticky it is. And that's going to help protect it a bit. You can also see this tunnel does not have trusses. And so I would be a little concerned if we got a heavy snow, I'd probably send somebody out there to clean it off periodically over the course of the night or the day. Three-season high tunnels are less common in this part of the country. They're a little bit unwieldy because they're often much larger, and we have a lot of wind here in Kansas, and so trying to deal with that can be a little bit problematic. This is one that we have here at the research station. This is a Haygrove tunnel. Haygrove comes from England, and essentially what they do is they send out a machine that bends all these hoops on site where that tunnel is where it's built, excuse me. This is a half acre, all 4 bays. We typically use three at a time and put one in cover cropping every year. And that's one of the nice things about it is it's big enough space that you can actually take it out of production and you don't feel like it's a big problem. There's a roping system that's used by Haygrove, and now people are using the same roping systems on caterpillar tunnels that actually holds down the poly. And this is a really effective system. Essentially, it's like shoelaces that run from one side to the other, and that rope is going to hold down that poly so that the wind doesn't blow it. Now, these tunnels are great because they're huge, right? And you can see here's one in Pennsylvania, this huge thermal mass in this multi-bay tunnel. Think about all that warmth that it's going to hold overnight can be really helpful. They're also nice too because they are such a big space. We can think about using them for sort of medium value crops. So here you can see a bunch of cantaloupe. You can't really tell in this picture, but the second half of this tunnel is all watermelon, right? So if you're interested in growing melons, these are great tunnels for that because they're big enough that you can just let them go a little bit wild. We also have three season tunnels can be used in for perennial production as well too, and they're kind of ideal for that. One of the things I should have mentioned earlier is we call them three season tunnels because we take the poly off during the wintertime. They can't hold a snow load because they don't have the framing for that. And so because of that, they actually work really well for perennials. These blueberries are still able to get their chilling hours. They usually go through the same seasonal variations in temperatures. They get winter precipitation. But then in the spring, we put the covers on that gets them growing a bit faster. It also helps keep the birds off, which is pretty handy. And we're off and running. Another nice thing about these types of tunnels, or really just any kind of tunnel where you're removing the cover, is it gives you the ability to grow cover crops and do some soil health building. And also allows you to bring in larger equipment. So you can see, you have to keep a very close eye on this roll bar. It's real close to this hoop, and whoever's the person driving the tractor needs to make sure they're very aware of that. But these multi-bay tunnels or three-season tunnels are often big enough, and again, they don't have in walls. You can see that. So it's real easy to get a tractor in and out of them. Caterpillar tunnels started out sort of as a do-it-yourself type of thing, and when we built ours, we did it ourselves. We got a hoop bender from Johnny's Seeds, but there are a couple different companies now that are selling kits that are pre-bent and made for Caterpillar tunnels. Back in the day when we made them ourselves, we used top rail from the fencing in order to do that. And typically, what we would do is we'd use the residential top rail for the hoops. So that's going to be a 1 7/8 pipe, excuse me, 1.5 inch pipe. And then we use commercial top rail for the footers, and that's 1 7/8. So here's what that looked like after we were done. We bent all the hoops. In our case, we did put a hip board on it because this experiment, it's hard to tell, but there's actually 6 different pieces of plastic that's being held down by this. So we were doing a light research study trying to understand how that plastic filtered light and how that affected crop productivity. But we wanted to use wiggle wire to hold the plastic on, which means we had to put a hip board on there as well. And this hip board is about 36 inches off the ground. Here you can see the inside of the tunnel. These hoops are 12 feet wide, about 7.5 feet tall. Here you can see those footers that are holding them in, and then we just basically put a bolt through there to hold those. Now with the Caterpillar tunnels, you can close them up tight in the wintertime. It's not going to be quite as tight as maybe a four-season tunnel with a permanent in wall, but you can warm them up pretty well. You can see in this picture, we're actually venting them. I've got little stakes that are holding up the sidewalls just enough to get a little bit of air. It's actually much colder than this picture communicates. And as I mentioned before, we're seeing some of these pre-manufactured kits being sold as well. Farmer's Friend, Bootstrap Farmer. There's a couple different companies that are selling these Caterpillar tunnels as kits, and they work really nicely. Again, they're going to use this roping system to hold them down, which is and also holds up the poly once you want to raise the sidewalls. And what's nice about these is they're quick enough to put up and take down that we have growers like Kevin and Jesse in Lawrence who every few years they'll just take the tunnel down and move it rather than trying if they're concerned about soil health issues or crop rotation, they'll grow inside of this thing for a couple 3 years, they'll move it to another spot on the farm, right? And so they're simple enough that you can do that. but they're not tall enough that they're going to work real well for indeterminate tomatoes, for example, right? And so, there are trade-offs that go along with that. So once you've decided on a frame type, you're going to have to think about how we're going to cover it, right? And there's more and more different types of polys out there. Typically for a high tunnel, we're going to use regular 6 mil clear poly. Now, what that means, there is a difference between clear and IR blocking, which is what we utilize mainly for greenhouse production. Um, it's going to be a little more expensive for IR AC plastic, and it's not really something you need in a high tunnel. So most folks would just recommend using the clear 6 mil poly. Now, one of the things that I've started to see more and more of, especially here in Kansas, is the use of these reinforced plastics. So regular greenhouse poly is 6 mil. This is like 10 to 12 to 15 mil. It's very thick. And you can see it has this string reinforcement, sort of like rebar in concrete, that holds it together so that if it does tear, the tear doesn't go very far, right? And I've had a couple of growers have told me it is a fair bit more expensive than typical poly, but for some of our folks in central and western Kansas, I think people are having pretty good luck with this stuff. Now, anytime you start manipulating that plastic, you're going to change the light conditions. And I do not know how much light these things cut out, but chances are it's going to be a bit more than your regular 6 mil poly. So here's your clear poly that we see. Again, this is just going to be your 6 mil. There's lots of different brands that are available out there. And typically, whoever you buy your high tunnel for is going to send it with a roll of poly to be put on. There's a lot of folks, I get a lot of questions about using a double layer of poly. So in greenhouses, it's quite common to use 2 layers of plastic and then one of these little squirrel cage fans to basically put an air pillow in between those 2 layers of poly. Now that provides some advantage in terms of R value, like an insulation value at night. It does likely hold the heat in a little bit better. But I think one of the biggest benefits, at least here, is that poly, once it's inflated, it's tight, it's stiff, right? It's rigid. And so that's going to make it more um, resistant to wind damage, and which can be a big issue, right? Especially like in this part of the country. And so that's one of the benefits of using that double layer is because it's taut and there's that air pillow in there, it keeps it from flapping around and causing problems. Because that's usually the issue when you have storm damage and wind damage. It's not really the plastic that hurts it, it's the flapping plastic, right? So if we can keep that plastic from moving, then usually we're going to be okay. Now it's important to recognize that all of these polys are going to cut anywhere from 10 to 12 to 15% of light out. And so with that second layer of poly, you're going to end up with a significant reduction in light. Diffuse poly is something that's really popular, especially for some of these multi-bay tunnels. Basically, what it does is it refracts the light as it's entering the tunnel. So the idea is that you actually don't cast a shadow because the poly actually, sort of points the light into the tunnel as the sun is hitting it. And we've done quite a bit of research with diffuse poly. You can see the difference when you just look at it. Here it is from above, and it's actually these multi-bay hay grow tunnels for a long time. They only sold it with diffuse plastic, but we've also used clear plastic on our multi-bay tunnel as well. But you can, again, from space, you can see the difference. It's actually quite impressive. In terms of sidewalls and in walls, there's lots and lots of options, and I'm just going to mention a few here that might be useful. Again, we're going to have an entire webinar just about sidewalls, one just about in walls, so we'll get into more details at that point. But there are a few things that I thought I would mention. One of the big things is we're starting to see a lot more growers building tunnels entirely out of metal and not using wood framing. And I'm a big fan of that, especially if you're certified organic. You're going to have big issues because you can't use treated lumber or you can't let treated lumber touch the soil, right? And so in that case, having that metal baseboard is nice because it's basically maintenance free. Doesn't ever have to be replaced, or at least that would be the hope. Um, so we're seeing more and more folks do this. This is a stumpy tunnel that we built a couple years ago, and you can see it's got all metal in-wall framing and sidewalls as well. In terms of the in wall itself, one of the things you want to be thinking about is sort of what is the purpose of the in wall? What do I need it for? Right. And so the big thing is obviously we need to be able to get in and out of it, and not just ourselves, but also any equipment that we might need, as well as using it for ventilation. And in-walls oftentimes are used for ventilation in the wintertime because we don't want to blow a bunch of cold air through the tunnel. We might open a door, open a gable vent. And then obviously protection, not just from the wind, but also from wildlife. One of the nicest things about growing in tunnels out where I am is it's one of the few places on the farm where the raccoons and the possum can't get to all of our crops. So, depending on what your needs are, you may or may not need a less or more complicated in wall. Now, this is probably the least complicated in wall that you could imagine. It's basically two by fours that are mounted with a hinge up at the peak. And then there's going to be plastic attached to that, either with lath or C-channel. And these two by fours just open up and you can get in and out of your tunnel. Now, back in the day, this was really common for people to use in walls like this. I haven't really seen one like this for a long time because I think people are getting smarter and now using permanent and rigid in walls. This poly, it does not take much of a windstorm for it to cause a big problem. And unfortunately, especially if it's attached to these two by fours, it can start pulling the frame out of shape. And so you really want to be careful about that. The other thing to keep in mind with the in walls, it does provide support for the hoop. And depending on how you build it, it can provide a lot of support for the hoop. And so, if you're going to be adding fixtures like fans, anything with any real weight, then you're going to want to think about that when you're putting together your framing design as well. Now, I think one of the most important things to put in an in wall is the gable vent. And unfortunately, I see a lot of high tunnels without gable vents. But as I mentioned before, they're really helpful, especially during the wintertime for ventilating that tunnel. And during the summertime, when it's really hot, you need pretty much every resource available to ventilate and cool that tunnel. This is a nifty DIY gable vent that one of our student workers actually designed and built several years ago. And we'll talk more about it when we get to the in walls webinar, but I just thought it was a really creative way to do it. And there's lots of ways you can get creative with some of this do-it-yourself stuff. Um, I also see more and more, and actually recommend to folks more and more, just go buy a greenhouse shutter, right? And even if you don't have power, it's really easy to operate those shutters manually. Uh, put a little piece of string on it, pull it down. It's sometimes that's the simplest way to do it, and they come pre-ready to go. All you just need to do is fit the size of the hole for that shutter, and it can work really well. So this is a fun design. This is my buddy Steve Moore built this tunnel. And one of the things there's a couple things I really like about it. One, you can see this is on an organic farm, so he's got twin wall polycarb that he's using for the glazing material or the covering essentially. He's got one of these rotating sort of gable vents. So again, this is a do-it-yourself kind of thing, but it worked well for him. And I could imagine actually putting that hinge down at the bottom also so that maybe you could bring it in to the inside of the tunnel. It might ventilate a little bit better. But one of the things I really liked about this tunnel when I saw it was look how he's got the doors. He has an entry door on one side for a person, like a people door, and then on the other side, you can open that up if you need to bring equipment in. And you can't tell in this picture, but this baseboard is actually removable. And so if you wanted to bring a tiller or a tractor or something in there, essentially you could open both doors, take out the baseboard, and you'd be able to easily do that. But during the wintertime, when you don't want to bring a bunch of cold air into the tunnel, you can just use this little walk-through entry door to get in and out of it. This is a sort of your garage door tunnel, and again, this is a film in wall, which we don't see as much any these days, but we do occasionally. These sort of garage door style in walls are nice because again, you can get a tractor, pretty large piece of equipment in there with that. But for many small high tunnels, you don't really need to get equipment in, right? And so you might just need an entry door, just a walk-through door, something big enough that you can put a little tiller in, or a wheelbarrow, or a push cart. But that might be the extent of the equipment that you're going to use inside of that tunnel. So you don't need that big giant door because you're not planning to put your tractor in there. What are some of the different glazing materials that we can use for the end wall? This is clear corrugated plastic. So this is actually the same material we use on pole barns, like for skylights. It's just got that corrugation. This stuff is a little bit more difficult to work with because it's kind of hard to cut compared to twin wall polycarb, but it's much less expensive. And so a lot of people utilize these for high tunnels. A lot of the greenhouse companies will sell these for high tunnels. Um, and they work just fine. Keep in mind that that corrugation is, a couple inches deep, and so when you put the flashing up here to hold that corrugated panel in, that can be a little bit trickier than when you're using twin wall polycarb, but otherwise it works perfectly well. Here you can see a similar tunnel with corrugated plastic for the in-wall glazing, but the reason I threw this in is it has this sliding door. In this case, we had two sliding doors that sort of open up from the middle, whereas in this one, this is a bigger tunnel. It had enough space on the end wall. They could just do one big door that slides over. And again, I think this is about a 6 or 7 foot door, so it's big enough. You can get a, fairly decent sized piece of equipment through there. Twin wall polycarbonate, I've mentioned a couple of times. This is a really popular glazing, especially for greenhouses, but also works great for high tunnels, partly because it's just easy to work with. All you need is a circular saw with a plastic blade, and you can cut this stuff really easily and shape it kind of however you need to. You can also bend it. People will put it up on the roofs of greenhouses as well. Typically, it's going to have better light penetration and a little bit longer lifespan than that corrugated plastic. And you can buy it in different thicknesses, 8 millimeter, 10 millimeter. I've even seen, I think I've seen 15 millimeter before. Typically for a high tunnel, the 8 millimeter is fine. If you're not heating it with a furnace, and we want to keep the heat in, but it's probably not worth the extra money for that 10 millimeter thicker polycarb. So here, these are some tunnels we have at the research station. You can see we did a big project really many years ago where we built the end walls. These are organic tunnels, and so you can see these are only 20 by 32 foot tunnels, so they're real small. We have no need for a tractor in them, so we just have a walk-through entry door, and we ended up just getting like a $150 door from Home Depot. Just a regular. Um, Not even an insulated door, aluminum door, I should say, and using those, and then the gable vent, and we sort of did that do-it-yourself design that I showed earlier. This is at a commercial farm here in Kansas, and these folks they have a bunch of tunnels actually. And at some point, they decided that they were tired of messing around with all the different materials the greenhouse companies were selling them, and they just used pole barn tin for their end walls. And from what I can tell, many of those tunnels they did that 10, 12 years ago, and they're doing just fine. And you can see they've got a big door so they can get equipment in if they need to. I thought this was a creative gable vent. They basically just have a block, like a framed block that goes in there, and then they screw it in and they leave it, right? And then when it's finally warm enough that they don't need any more, they just take it back out. Now, keep in mind, these folks do not grow in the wintertime. They're only growing during the summer, and they're primarily growing tomatoes, right, with these tunnels. And so they're not going to need to open that gable vent a whole bunch like somebody that's growing spinach or greens during the winter. In terms of sidewalls, there's lots of options there too. Typically, it's going to be either a roll-up sidewall or a drop-down sidewall. And you can do fun things too. We're getting more and more interest with water catchment systems. This is at a non-for-profit farm here in Kansas City. They just built this last year. Um, but there's lots of options for sidewalls that work really well. And some of these are do it yourself, and some of them come as kits. One thing to point out is that oftentimes people will use that reinforced plastic or a different material for the sidewall, so it's hard to tell here. This is basically a fabric or a clear cloth that's used for the sidewall, and that's just going to be a lot stronger to the wind, which can be pretty helpful, especially for drop-down sidewalls. For roll-up sidewalls, they're going to be your least expensive, sort of, and this is probably the easiest thing to do if you're building onto a used high tunnel. is just basically have a piece of top rail or a long pole here, roll that plastic up on it, and then we'll put a little crank on this end on one end, and we use a rope basically to hold that crank up when once we get it rolled all the way up. Now keep in mind with this tunnel, it's either all the way open, or it's kind of it's very difficult to open it halfway. If we had different roping system, we probably could, but it works pretty well and it costs very little to do this kind of thing. And you can see the roping that holds that sidewall on the outside from keep the wind from blowing it. You can get automated roll up and roll down sidewalls. This is a farm we went to in Massachusetts, and they had this. I've seen these actually at several different tunnel manufacturers are now selling these advanced alternatives motors that are driven and they run the sidewall up and down. We actually, our movable tunnel has them, but they're not specific to one company. So you can find them with several different companies. And they can be really helpful if you do have power at your site. Having automated sidewalls is really nice. Now, keep in mind, they can also be a complete and total disaster because if something goes wrong with a sidewall and it starts trying to do things automatically, it's going to turn into a huge mess. And so you got to be really careful about that. Drop-down sidewalls are typically more expensive and they're really useful, especially for wintertime growing. And there's lots of different ways that these are constructed. I'll show you a couple of pictures, but depending on what manufacturer you get this thing from, it's going to come in different shapes and forms. So the big advantage of these drop-down sidewalls, as you can see here in the very early spring, and this is with warm season crops, there's advantage as well. That cool air that's blowing outside, it's not going to blow right across the crop. It's going to blow up here, and it's going to cool the whole tunnel, but it's not going to be blowing, 35-degree air on your tomatoes, right? So there's definitely an advantage to having that, but there is quite a bit of cost associated with it as well. And in this case, there's actually this metal pole that ran down the length of the tunnel, and then that pole would spin either by a crank or by a motor, and then that was attached to the sidewalls with strings that would then get pulled up. One of the really common ones we see around here, Stuppy as well as Zimmerman's Greenhouses sells these ratchet-based system where they basically have a ratchet cable and then a string attaches to the cable and it's going to draw that sidewall up and down. Now, I will tell you that if you plan to build your high tunnel yourself and you get a drop-down sidewall curtain, plan several days for the construction of that thing. They're not super easy to put together. And the instructions out there that exist have gotten better and better. But just be aware that if you're doing this for the first time, it's going to take you a little bit of time to put together that drop-down sidewall. It's probably the most complicated part of building a high tunnel if you're going to use it. Just a note about shade cloth. I do think this is part of the high tunnel system. This is 55% shade used really for transplant production. I wouldn't go much higher than 30% shade if you're going to, but it is, depending on what part of the country you're in, I would go ahead and get a piece of shade cloth, especially if the NRCS can help you pay for it, because it's something you're going to use. But you just want to be careful with shade cloth. Unfortunately, shade cloth does hold snow. And so you got to pull those things off in the fall. You shouldn't have a shade cloth on in the fall anyways. But the minute it snows, that snow will stick to that shade cloth and cause a very, very big problem. So be really careful about that. So just to wrap things up, you really want to plan not only for your environment and your climate, but also your market and what you're planning to grow, and to the best of your ability, how you're planning to grow. And I know oftentimes we don't have all the answers in the beginning and we learn along the ways, but do your best to find a tunnel or a high tunnel design that's going to be at least, you know, um, flexible enough that it's going to be at least in the right ballpark for you for what you're planning to grow. Um, Keep in mind that thing is a long-term investment. So put the money in now for the way you want it to operate. And also when it comes to things like permanent in walls, they're going to protect you in the long run from windstorms, from heartache, from maintenance, right? And so sometimes you can put a little bit money in now that turns out to be a much better long-term investment than putting the money in over and over and over again as you have to repair problems. As I mentioned before, we want to maximize thermal mass and again, just always be thinking about ventilation and how you're going to orient that tunnel and how big it is in terms of where you're going to site it within the farm. All right, so that's all I have today. I appreciate your all's attention. It looks like there's just a minute or two. I'd be happy to answer some questions. If you don't have any questions, I will uh, give you a prize if somebody can identify what kind of damage this is in this gable vent. I will stop sharing. Well, actually, shucks. So you're welcome to put any questions in the chat if you have any. Meteorite. You know what? You're actually pretty close. This is actually hail damage, believe it or not. I showed up at the farm one day and we had hail like the size of my fist, pieces of hail laying around. And when this gable vent was hit, it was actually open. So the gable vent was sitting vertically. The hail came through the plastic and smashed through that gable vent. It's pretty impressive. All right. Well, if we don't have any questions, I appreciate your all's attention today, and be sure to join us on March 18th. We're certainly gonna have a nice webinar there, and tell your friends all about it. And thanks again to NIFA and the Beginning Farmer Rancher Grant Program for helping to support this.